Hello, everyone, and welcome to week three of our quarter and week three of our class. And I want to thank you all for giving the readings and the practices of the first 2 weeks a shot. And I can tell from the journal entries, from some of you who were open to sharing your letter to the body with me. I can really tell that you really engaged these assignments and this reading earnestly. You put your heart into it, and of course, we can't force you to do that. We're going to just invite you to do that, and also join you, meet you there as well. As we put our hearts into this class and its assignments as well, and we don't take that for granted. Just want to say thank you and express my gratitude for that. I also acknowledge that a lot of what we've been reading, a lot of what we've been reflecting on, and what we've been practicing, they can be quite provocative, and they can also bring up some difficult memories and experiences from our life and our life journey. And also appreciate for many of you reaching out to me personally and just sharing some of how and why some of the readings might have been hard for you. And I want to validate that and just say that it's totally okay for you to read, at your own pace. And, if you hit a chapter and you feel like, well, this is getting a little bit too personal, too quick, I don't think it's going to be super productive for me to read this, and go all the way into this reading. I just want to explicitly say that you have my full permission to just skim through that really quickly or even skip it. We just want you to, feel like you have the agency and choice to be able to pause and not feel compelled to do something that you don't feel ready to. These last 2 weeks, we spent a lot of time reading and talking about embodiment and this notion of embodied cognition. And this idea behind embodied cognition is this reality, this idea that our minds not only affect our bodies, but also goes the other way around. Our bodies also affect our minds at times. And how all of this is part of a complex, dynamical human system, as Warren Brown describes it in his videos. The part of this complex, dynamical system that we all inhabit as human beings. Have you ever seen those really funny Snickers commercials? I think that's a wonderful example of this of embodied cognition, of how not only does the mind affect the body, but the body affects the minds. And I think the punchline of these Snickers commercials is that when we're hungry, we oftentimes will think and speak and behave as if we're a totally different person than we typically are. And that's just one example of how the body can very much profoundly shape, the rest of the dimensions of ourselves. And again, the reality is that the body and the mind impact each other. And sometimes it's the mind to the body, and other times it's the body to the mind. And in my therapy practice, when I work with trauma survivors and many different kinds of patients, oftentimes what I'll start with first is I will seek to rule out the bodily or physiological possibilities before we jump into the actual emotional work. So, I'll check in about people's sleeping habits. I'll check in about people's eating habits, if they're getting enough exercise, if there's something that they're neglecting uh, when it comes to their body, or if their body's trying to communicate something to them and they're not listening. And oftentimes I find that if we are able to identify some of those things early on, it actually makes the emotional, the psychological processes that follows a lot more straightforward. It might actually address half or even more of the totality of what needed to be addressed in the therapy process. And another reason why it's important for us to talk about cognition and embodied cognition is that for a long time, the dominant model of psychology and how it viewed cognition was in fact disembodied. So as a field, we're starting to realize more and more that cognition is not just about thinking. It's not just the thoughts in our minds. It's also about perception, sensation, awareness. And when I think of, my role as a pastor and, about spiritual formation, I also would agree with that this applies to spiritual formation as well, that, who our formation as mature Christians, it's not just about cognition, like what our thoughts are, what we believe. That's certainly a part of it and a very important part of it. But all these other facets, uh, you know, are just as important, and that our living of the gospel, our formation into the likeness of Christ, how that has to be a holistic and embodied process. And we are embodied people, and that's the case because we're embodied people embedded in this world that is a physical world as well as a spiritual world. We don't just have bodies, but we are bodies. And certainly our bodies isn't all that there is about us, but it's difficult and even impossible to try to tease out the body when we talk about who we are fundamentally. And as you've read, oftentimes our bodies have a wisdom that is critically important for us to listen to. And even in situations where perhaps in the moment our body is trying to pull us into some hurtful or dysfunctional or self-destructive behavior, listening to our body doesn't mean that we're going to actually do everything our body is trying to tell us to do at that moment. But even in those situations, I would suggest that it's the body is still probably trying to communicate something to us that is really important that we perhaps have not heard adequately yet. So that was the last few weeks. This coming week, in week 3, we're going to transition to the topic of trauma and trauma-informed approaches to ministry. And one of the reasons why we're talking about trauma in week 3, right after our first 2 weeks on embodiment, is because trauma is fundamentally an embodied reality. So I happen to be a trauma psychologist, and most of my clinical practice, I'm doing trauma work with various survivors of different forms of trauma. And I can speak from firsthand and also third-hand experience, watching and accompanying others heal from these things, being in my own healing process as well. That healing from stuff like trauma, it has to involve the body. If we were to just try to make trauma therapy a purely cognitive exercise where we just kind of download information and truths and expect it to just, magically heal us, we're probably going to be disappointed. And the reason is because our body, because it was wounded in the trauma, it also has to be involved. It has to be a real central player that takes part in the healing process. And again, without going into the details, I know that this class isn't about doing therapy. At times, if I feel like, and I'm doing trauma therapy, and I feel like the person I'm working with is trying to just make it a cognitive exercise, sometimes I will activate or trigger them on purpose, in controlled, you know, um, safely in a controlled environment. And because I know that you actually can't heal from the trauma until the trauma is triggered in your body. And only when the trauma is triggered in your body are the trauma memories, the trauma thoughts, the trauma related emotions, and the trauma, related everything. Only that, then and only then are all of those things brought out to bear. And once they're brought out to bear, then we can start doing something with it. Then we can start speaking into it, and then we can start going about the process of healing and holding and giving it the right ingredients to change over time. And with the topic of trauma-informed care, and as you'll see in several excellent videos by Dean Cynthia Erickson in the School of Psychology and Marriage and Family Therapy, with trauma-informed care, we're asking you to think about the systemic dynamics at play as you potentially work with others who have trauma history. So, we're going to invite you to consider questions like, well, how might churches or ministries look differently if we took seriously the reality that most of the people who come into our doors actually have trauma histories? And we're not just talking about the congregation. We're not just talking about the people that ministries are there to serve, but we're also talking about the staff, the ministry staff. We're also talking about the pastors themselves. Most of us have trauma histories. And if we were to take it more seriously, this reality, if we were to take this reality more seriously, how different might we do things? How might our the messages we hear on Sunday, how might they be different? How might we approach children's ministry differently than they are? How might we try to shape the cultures of our spiritual communities differently in light of this reality? So I want to encourage you to view Dean Erickson's excellent videos on trauma-informed ministry. And then for this coming week's reading, we're going to read a book titled Homecoming, um, Overcoming Fear, How to Overcome Fear and Trauma to Reclaim Your Whole Authentic Self by Dr. Tama Bryant Davis, who's just a total rock star. She's the former president of the American Psychological Association. She's a pastor from the AME tradition. She's from Liberia. I had the privilege of being there for about a week as well with the AME church, by the way. She's a therapist. She's just an incredible human being, and you will read her entire book. And I hope it's going to go pretty smoothly, and I hope it'll be a blessing to you all because, this book is not so much an academic or a technical book. It's more of a popular book written for a general audience that's designed to be accessible and to hold our daily experiences and be very practical and relevant. And in addition to her book, Dr. Tama actually spoke in our 2020 Fuller Integration Lectures. So you'll be watching that as well this week. And on top of that, a couple of our Fuller students were able to track her down when her book Homecoming first came out, and they recorded a podcast with her. So we're going to also invite you to view that as well. And as I read her book, even as a trauma psychologist, I really enjoyed it. It was very profitable for me to read that as well. I feel like she writes in a very humanizing and accessible way. And, I especially appreciated her chapter on the importance of mourning and mourning the different kinds of losses that often accompany trauma. And as I'm training psychologists to become trauma informed and to do trauma work, I oftentimes will say that trauma therapy is very much the same thing or akin to grief therapy. Like trauma therapy essentially is grief therapy because all traumas inform some form of loss, whether it's concrete or symbolic. Well, a lot more I can talk about that, but I know this is just an introduction video. For this coming week, we are going to invite you to engage in a breathing exercise. And appreciate you giving that a shot. And because this is week 3, this is also going to be the first week of our formation groups. So looking forward to you all getting to know each other and meeting together within that context. And like last week, I want to invite you to join me this coming Friday at 4 p.m. Pacific time, as I will host another kind of live session. And last week's live session was fantastic. Our conversation went lots of different really thoughtful places and directions. And I hope I didn't scare anyone off. And if you weren't able to join us last week, I hope you'll consider joining us for this week as well. I think that's it for now, and hope you have a great start to the week. Take care.